What should the average American know about Nigeria? Well, Nigeria is Africa's most populous country, with about 180 million individuals straddling both sides of the Niger River. The country is nearly equally divided in terms of religion, with about 60% of the nation identifying as Christian and the other 40% as Muslim. Nigeria also has some of Africa's largest oil deposits, with about 20 billion of the 66 billion barrels of proven oil reserves in all of Africa, along with 3 trillion cubic meters of natural gas. And unsurprisingly, Nigeria suffers from some of the worst poverty in the entire world. But why does a country with so much going for it in terms of natural resources have such terrible poverty and a life expectancy of just 53 years of age? Well, the answer might lie in exactly who controls Nigeria's oil reserves. International companies like Chevron and Shell. International companies have been exploiting Nigeria for decades with little to no kickback to Nigerians, excepting, of course, the powerful and corrupt elites who run the country and who keep the oil and contracts flowing. But recently, vigilante groups in Nigeria like the Niger Delta Avengers have been striking back against oil companies and their installations in the south of Nigeria. To discuss the nitty-gritty of this situation in Nigeria, we're joined by RT correspondent Caleb Maupin. Welcome, Caleb.
Always a pleasure to have you on, Caleb.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Sure.
Interesting reporting that you've done here and looking into this. Now, for our viewers, let's just start things off and describe to me what the conditions are like in Nigeria and in and around the Niger Delta. Just, I think it's important we get that context as we kind of look at what they're facing, and why they're doing what they're doing now.
Well, sure. I mean, Nigeria is a very wealthy country. They've got oil, they've got natural gas, they've also got mineral resources. Very, very rich country. But the people there live in a lot of poverty, just a lot of poverty. In fact, 70% of the population lives below the poverty line, according to the CIA World Factbook. They also indicate that illiteracy is very high. They talk about the fact that 1 in 3 Nigerian children works as a child laborer. I mean, these are horrendous conditions in a country that has a real abundance of natural resources.
I mean, if anything, they should be like running the table, given how much wealth is within this country.
Right.
Sure. Yes, I mean, now the government of Nigeria is very much seen as kind of a puppet of these oil companies. The current president, Buhari, he was actually the military dictator of Nigeria between 1983 and 1985. Now, he took power after the last election, just completely embraced by the United States, despite that there's a long record of human rights violations, people being jailed for speaking out and criticizing the government.
So we know that these corporations are behind a lot of this suffering, a lot of this poverty in Nigeria. But what specifically is the relationship between the oil companies and this poverty? Well,
now, the Niger Delta region, now that's the region where the oil is extracted from. That's about 70% of Nigeria's national income comes from this Niger Delta region. These are the poorest people in the country. They live in fear not only of the police and the military, which have a reputation for corruption, but also for Shell Oil's private army. Shell Oil has 1,200 soldiers of their own, a private security force that acts like an army, and this population lives in terror. And there's just a lot of pollution. I mean, there are oil spills and oil fires almost every day in the Niger Delta region. People are breathing in air that is polluted by these oil fires. We've seen there are pictures that have surfaced of children playing on beaches that are black with crude oil from oil spills. I mean, the conditions there are just horrendous.
Let me ask you, is there a connection between, I mean, it's a silly question, honestly. Is there a connection between a life expectancy of 53 years of age and what's going on with these oil companies?
Absolutely, and the international community has repeatedly called on Shell Oil to stop their practices and get their environmental practices in order, stop having oil spills so frequently, but many people say things are not getting better in the Niger Delta region, and conditions are only getting worse, unfortunately.
Which is what's leading to, you wrote about these groups called, I mean, one, the name, the Niger Delta Avengers, who've been mounting these attacks against the oil company that, what have these attacks looked like, and what have the results been? What kind of action have they've been committing there?
Well, essentially, they've been going out and blowing up oil pipelines. As of now, there are 23 oil pipelines that are not functioning because they've been blown up. And in June, there's been an average of about 1 bombing every day of these oil pipelines. And as of today, from what I understand, oil production has been stopped in Nigeria very massively because of these bombings, and it's actually the lowest it's been since 1989. So this is having a huge impact on the international economy.
Well, the next obviously natural question is like, how have the oil companies and, if you say a puppet government, how has, the authorities in that region responded to this?
Well, now, President Buhari has said he's willing to negotiate, but he's also trying to get the situation under control. The military is getting ready to go into the area. It's a very intense situation. If you look at the statements these groups are putting out on social media, their demand is that the oil of the Niger Delta region be used for the people there. They want things like health care. They want things like education. They want an end to these environmental practices that are just affecting people's living standards and lifestyle. And they're making these demands very clear. Some of them are even calling for the Niger Delta to separate. That's a demand that some of them want the region itself to become separate from the rest of Nigeria.
Wow. That's incredible.
Well, let me ask you, what's the connection between, I mean, obviously this isn't happening without some sort of, I don't want to say collusion or corruption with the U.S. government, but it has to be done with there has to be some connection or some work that they're doing. How does it actually connect to American politics, to what's going on there?
Well, Nigeria is one of the top recipients of U.S. aid on the African continent. Nigeria buys weapons from the United States. There are U.S. military advisors in Nigeria working hands-on with the Nigerian military. The Nigerian government and the U.S. government are very, very close. In fact, Buhari came to the United States immediately after he was elected president. Barack Obama praised him, saying he had a reputation for integrity. So the two governments, the U.S. government and the Nigerian government, they work hand in hand.
And there's no evidence to say that we would actually pivot and say, hey, maybe we should help these people out who are fighting back against these companies.
I wouldn't count on that.
There's nothing saying that there's any reason that would happen. Right.
Now, we often hear in the media about Boko Haram and its status as a terror organization and its relationship with ISIS. What do we know about Boko Haram, and how is that group related possibly to the strife in Nigeria and the extreme poverty going on in that country?
Well, it's very interesting. Since 2009, Boko Haram has been waging their campaign of violence, but Hillary Clinton refused to list them as a terror organization when she was the Secretary of State. They weren't actually listed by the United States as a foreign terror organization until 2013. A lot of commentators say that they believe that the Nigerian state, especially on some of the local and regional levels, has a relationship with Boko Haram, because it seems very strange that they could have so much power, they could be going for so long, and that there's a regional aspect to this, that some of the Islamic regions feel like the national government isn't paying attention to them. They're supporting Boko Haram, and it's a complicated situation. Yeah, I mean, it's very, very complex. They have called themselves now the African wing of ISIS, which is an interesting thing.
Well, I wonder, we hear a lot about the violence. We hear a lot about movements that are active military-type movements against these oil companies. Are there peaceful movements in Nigeria that oppose the violence, but also oppose this sort of Western intervention and the oil companies? Are there peaceful movements?
Now, there's a cleric named Sheikh Ibrahim al-Zakzaki, and he was leading the Islamic movement in Nigeria. This was a group that was protesting against corruption and also trying to have dialogue between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria and bridge the gap. Now, in December, the city that he's based in, Zaria, the neighborhood he works out of, was raided by the Nigerian military. At least 300 people were killed. These are unarmed people were killed. And Sheikh Ibrahim al-Zakzaki, he actually remains in military detention. The Nigerian military is holding him without any criminal charges, refuses to release him. And you can go back even further. In the 1990s, there was a case of a filmmaker, Ken Saro-Wiwa. Now, this is an award-winning filmmaker, got all kinds of awards from the United Nations for his environmental work, criticizing Shell Oil and other corporations. He was arrested. Within 8 hours of being arrested by the Nigerian military, he was tried by a military tribunal, and he was hanged. And actually, family members proved in federal court in the United States that Shell Oil had corrupted the legal system in Nigeria to make sure that this opponent of them, this environmental activist, was killed. I mean, there's just all kinds of corruption. And I think part of the reason we're seeing this rise in violence from the Niger Delta region is people are saying we've tried to be peaceful. We've tried peaceful organizing, and look what happens. We get smashed.
Wow, that's interesting. Now, final question, probably got maybe about a minute left, but what impact can we as Westerners have on the situation in Nigeria and other countries in similar situations? Like, what can people do in your research that you found?
Well, I mean, one thing that must be pointed out is that Nigeria is now the top oil exporter in Africa because Libya was destroyed. Libya used to be the top oil exporting country. And the reason that Libya was destroyed was allegedly because of concerns about human rights, the NATO bombing campaign. but Libya had a state-owned oil company, an oil company that wasn't controlled by Western corporations. And as a result, they had not the lowest but the highest life expectancy on the African continent. They had guaranteed health care and housing for the population, paid for with the proceeds of a government-controlled and locally controlled oil company that they used for their domestic economy. And that's no longer the case, and now Nigeria is the top oil exporter because Libya has been bombed and ruined.
The best thing for people to do would be to try to help in whatever way, push for Nigeria to take over and have control of their own resources as opposed to letting, you know, multinational corporations control it. Obviously. Caleb Muppin, thank you so much for coming on and sharing this with us.
Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, sir.
Great.